make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
James Madison records in his notes, he says, the convention, except for 3 or 4 persons, thought prayer was unnecessary. And the fascinating thing to me about that is the convention was closed, right? There was nobody outside looking in. And in fact, they took an oath of secrecy to not talk about what happened there for 50 years and not to publish anything about it. So when nobody on the outside was paying attention or could know what was happening, they didn't think they needed prayer. But what publicly you do get some public displays of piety.
Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and Josh, your faithful host, can't be here today. He's dealing with stuff. So today we are talking with Andrew Seidel. He serves as the Vice President, Strategic Communications for Americans United, and is a dedicated attorney who spent over a decade defending the First Amendment. He's the author of 2 significant books, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Not American, and American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. Also, as a senior correspondent at Religion Dispatches, he's known for his numerous op-eds and scholarly articles. He's publicly debated issues like the Johnson Amendment and contributed to the influential report Christian Nationalism at the January 6, 2021 Insurrection, published by the BJC and the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He's an expert on Christian nationalism and has been a vocal opponent of it both in court and its public sphere. And there's one thing here that I got to make sure I ask you before this is all over about your debate with Bill O'Reilly on Fox News.
Yeah, we can do that. We can talk about that.
So welcome to the show, Andrew.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Okay, so let's just get this out of the way. Like, why were you debating Bill O'Reilly?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to go into those spaces and present those audiences with good arguments and real facts as opposed to alternative facts. I kind of love getting in the mix with people I disagree with. The Bill O'Reilly one was really interesting, though, because that was my first TV appearance ever. So I was a new attorney, newly doing First Amendment church-state separation, and had to go on and argue against Bill O'Reilly on Fox News. And it's this bizarre experience because if you've never done this, you know, people don't know how weird it is. You are looking at a camera in a studio and you just have earbuds in and Bill O'Reilly's just like in your brain. It's really disconcerting. Yeah, so that was my first experience both with national television and with Fox News. It was fun though. I enjoyed it. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere. So
how did you think you did?
I think I held my own. So I practiced beforehand because you know the whole shtick on Fox News is they interrupt you to try to knock you off what you want to say. And if you are born and raised by anybody with manners, you know that it's rude to interrupt. So you know you kind of stop talking when that happens. But if you do that on Fox, you're just going to get railroaded. You're going to get overrun. So what I did, I had like an hour before I had to go to the studio, and I turned on the TV and I found those like really terrible local commercials with like, you know, used car salesmen and stuff. And I turned the volume up really loud and I just tried to not stop talking. That was how I trained myself to go on to Fox News.
I wish I knew that because when we talked with Clay Clark, the founder of the Reawaken Tour, I mean, it was a good interview. It was difficult. But he filibustered basically the entire episode. And I was like, I mean, I can mute him from this side, but it's like, do I want to? Like, I don't know. It just feels unprofessional. So, all right. So yeah, tell us like, why did you decide to kind of get into, you know, this whole separation of church and state thing? Like when you went to law school, like, were you thinking to yourself, you know what, I really think that's an area that I want to work in?
No, I went to law school to save the world. I mean, literally, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do environmental law, and I did an environmental law concentration. I worked in the environmental law clinic. I actually won an environmental law award. And then I went on to get an LLM, which is a master's of law in international environmental law. I did a fellowship there, but when I was in law school, after I took my First Amendment class, and I kind of fell in love with this principle, with this truly unique and original American principle, the separation of church and state. And it really is an American original. It's an American invention. And the more that I learned about that principle, the more I realized how powerful it was as an issue. And I also realized that it was something that Christian nationalists and the opponents of church-state separation had realized a long time ago, which is that having a robust separation of church and state connects to almost every other issue that I care about. Seriously, I think people don't realize how important limiting the power of religion in our government is, building up that wall of separation between church and state. The only wall we need, by the way. I mean, it's almost a panacea. If you want better education or full funding for public schools instead of vouchers for private religious schools, if you want accurate science about evolution and sex taught in our classrooms, if you want full civil and political rights for LGBTQ people and women and minorities, if you want reproductive justice and choice to be fully realized, if you want a greener world and a healthier environment, and you want to get serious about climate change, I mean, this is one of the reasons I got into it. If you want access to better and universal health care, or you want scientific research to be guided by scientists. Heck, you want to solve the problems in the Middle East, or you want our responses to pandemics to be guided by science instead of wishful thinking. If you end Christian nationalism, if you end religious encroachments into our government, you're going to see progress on every one of those issues. And the more I realized that, the more I was like, I can have a much bigger impact if I get into this space than I would if I became one of the thousands of environmental lawyers out there. And I was actually talking with my sister when I kind of first had the opportunity to come and work at some of the nonprofits that do this. And she was like, well, I was kind of hemming and hawing. I was like, I'm not sure what I should do. And she was like, well, how many lawyers out there do environmental stuff versus this? And, I know every lawyer who does church-state separation. There's like 15 of us. That's it. So I think I've had a much bigger impact here. Yeah.
Okay. So because we're going to be talking about Christian nationalism, at length in this conversation, as well as the separation of church and state, maybe we can just start with just some definitions. Like how would you define Christian nationalism?
I would say that Christian nationalism, it's a number of different things, actually. And there are a lot of really good definitions out there. So if you ask my friends Andrew Whitehead or Sam Perry or even Robbie Jones, who are sociologists who study the data here, they'll give you a very good scholarly synthesized definition. I think that Christian nationalism is the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, that we're based on Judeo-Christian principles, and most importantly, that we have strayed from that foundation, right? That we've gotten away from our godly roots. And Christian nationalists use the language of return and these calls to return to those godly roots to justify this hateful, harmful, exclusionary ideology and the public policy that goes along with it. Some examples from the Trump administration, right, are the Muslim ban. I mean, that was Christian nationalism written into the law. The child separation policy at the border. A lot of people forget that both Jeff Sessions, who was Attorney General at the time, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the press secretary, justified that policy by pointing to the Bible, by pointing to Romans 13, which Jeff Sessions learned to do, by the way, in the White House Bible study, which was a thing for a while. It is, I think for a long time, it was sort of, Christian nationalism was sort of viewed as this scholarly debate about, was America founded as a Christian nation or not? Did the founders believe this or did they not? But what we have learned and what we have seen is that it really is a harmful, exclusionary ideology that's bent on seizing power in the here and now. And I think one of the best examples for that, kind of ripped off its mask really on January 6th and showed the world what it really was.
Yeah. So when we talk about, separation of church and state, I mean, we've spoken to a number of theologians, sociologists, what have you. Mm-hmm. Some of the ones, there's one camp where people say, church and state separation is somewhat absolute. It goes both ways. And others say, the church and state is really keeping state out of churches. So where do we draw the line when we think about, church state separation?
Yeah, the idea of a one-way wall of separation just doesn't work. Like, the founders would not have chosen the wall as the metaphor if they wanted it to be a one-way thing. I mean, I do think it's important to note that one of the reasons we have a separation of church and state is because that is one of the best ways to protect true religious freedom. And that is something that I think often falls by the wayside in these discussions. But if the government can coerce you, certainly you don't have religious freedom. But if the government can pressure you or suggest to you with the full power of we the people that you should pray on this day or pray in this way, you also don't have religious freedom. And to me, I think the separation of church and state, one of the ways that I have been framing it for folks lately is that violations of the separation of church and state are abuses of power. Right. And what I mean by that is our government is one of limited power. It can't do everything. In fact, it's in many ways very limited. And it has no religion to exercise, which I will elaborate on in just a second. But when government officials take that power of the office that they are temporarily occupying and the resources that are attached to that office to promote their personal religion, they are abusing their power in very real and fundamental ways. And we don't talk about separation of church and state like that, but I really think we should. Because when we see that line transgressed, it is an abuse of power and it violates the religious freedom of every single citizen. But the idea that our government doesn't have a religion to exercise is also really crucial. And it goes back to something I said just a minute ago when I was talking about how I fell in love with this idea, right? Because the wall of separation is an American original. It is an American invention, right? The idea was floating around in the Enlightenment, but it was first implemented in the American experiment. Until then, no other nation in the history of the world had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating religion and government. And there's a lot that's wrong with our Constitution, but this is one thing that the framers got right. And in fact, most of the truly unique and original elements of our Constitution are secular. So our Constitution was the first to declare that power comes from people, not gods. Right? The words "we the people" in there are poetic, but they're also so much more. Our Constitution was the first governing document not to mention a god or a deity. And it was godless by choice, not by accident. There were actually a number of people in the founding generation who objected to that choice. Our Constitution was the first to ban religious tests for public office, and it does this in Article 6, which was the only mention of religion in the original unamended document. And it bans these religious tests in some of the most clear and emphatic language in a document that's often deliberetely vague. Like, yeah, everybody learned this in school, right? Like, there are parts of the Constitution where the founders were just kind of like punting and kicking it down the road, right? You remember. Yeah. Like, so it's often deliberately vague, but not this ban on religious tests. It says no religious test shall ever be required to any office or public trust, right? No, shall, ever, any. It's really clear and emphatic language. So again, a whole lot that's wrong with our Constitution. But the secular foundations are what made it unique and are genuine contributions, not just to political science and thought, but to all of humanity.
Interesting. So it's like I can understand how some people, think that this is a Christian nation because, like, in the contracting world, there's like scope creep, right? So like you start creeping a bunch of like little small amendments or provisions, and then all of a sudden you're like, hey, we own the whole thing, and it's like you've got stuff like the prayer breakfast, you've got like the congressional prayer, and you look around, you're like, but. Like I can kind of understand, but like, what do you think? What do you think most Americans probably get wrong when they think about the separation of church and state?
I mean, so that is the subject of my first book, The Founding Myth. I mean, like, in fact, both of the reason it's in my head is because both of the things you mentioned, the prayer breakfast and the prayers before Congress, are in that book, and I explore them, and I explore kind of all of those different threads where people are like, but we do this, and we say we have a separation of church and state. How do we do this? And I mean, the fact is, like, the founders were flawed men, deeply flawed in many instances, and did things that contradicted their stated principles all the time, like in some really big and fundamental ways. And a lot of the things that we think about are actually, first of all, not from that time even. So for instance, the National Prayer Breakfast didn't start till the 1950s, which is also when you get "In God We Trust" is adopted as the motto, when you get "Under God" put in the pledge, we had this wave of Christian nationalism that crashed over the country in the 1950s and left us with all of these scars of Christian nationalism that people now turn and point to and say, see, we were founded as a Christian nation. But it's like, no, those are actually disfiguring scars from previous waves of Christian nationalism that don't indicate that we were founded. And I just wrote an article over the 4th of July, which was, I sort of adapted from my book, The Founding Myth, about that, one of those first prayers. Because you hear this all the time. Well, the founders prayed at the Constitutional Convention. Well, that's not true. That's actually the opposite of what was true. Ben Franklin proposed prayer when the convention was deadlocked at one point, and there's some people who even think that, like, maybe he was being facetious. I mean, it's Ben Franklin. It's kind of hard to know, you know. But James Madison records in his notes, he says, the convention, except for 3 or 4 persons, thought prayer was unnecessary. And the fascinating thing to me about that is the convention was closed. Right? There was nobody outside looking in. And in fact, they took an oath of secrecy to not talk about what happened there for 50 years and not to publish anything about it. So when nobody on the outside was paying attention or could know what was happening, they didn't think they needed prayer. But what publicly you do get some public displays of piety. One popular one that we hear about is George Washington knelt in the snow at Valley Forge and prayed. No, he didn't. He didn't. In fact, the person who gave us that story is the same guy who made up the myth about Washington not being able to tell a lie after he chops down the cherry tree. This guy was a parson, right? He was clergy. It was named Mason Weems, and it doesn't appear in his. You can't even call it a biography of Washington because he just did not care about facts or reality. Like, he just cared about selling books. It doesn't appear until like until like, I think it was the 30th, somewhere around the 30th edition of the biography, right? Like, he's just adding to this to try to sell. So a lot of the things that we think of as, well, this shows that we're a Christian nation, are not true and are not reality. They are these myths that have been built up to show and betray the true founding, which is what I was just explaining about how, you know, we have this American original, this idea, that this American invention of the separation of church and state, in an effort to kind of take it down.
So as a lawyer, like, how do you use law to, I don't know, argue cases that deal with, you know, this church-state separation and or like religious freedom? Like, I'd be curious on like what's your process, or is it just you consistently just saying First Amendment kind of stuff?
Well, it's a question that all of us are struggling with these days, and that is because our Supreme Court has been captured. Right, the U.S. Supreme Court there was essentially a hostile takeover orchestrated of the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's what my second book, American Crusade, is about. And so over the last decade, you see this court really turning away from and warping both religion and the law and the separation of church and state. So in fact, one of the best overviews of all of the significant cases involving the separation of church and state and involving religious freedom comes from Justice Sotomayor in her dissent in the Carson versus Macon case, which was not from last term, but the term before. And that was a case about forcing taxpayers in Maine to fund Christian schools that indoctrinate children into one particular religion, and which also discriminate against LGBTQ students and families and staff. Again, all with your tax dollars. And the first line of her dissent explains that the last 5 to 10 years of religion and the law in the court have been, I have it here. Hang on. Let me just read it. She says, this court continues to dismantle the wall of separation between church and state that the framers fought to build. Okay? And then she ends, it's a very short dissent, and then she ends and she says, she's looking back and she says, what a difference 5 years makes. In 2017, I feared the court was leading us to a place where separation of church and state is a constitutional slogan, not a constitutional commitment. And she's citing an opinion she wrote from 2017. And then she ends and she says, today, the court leads us to a place where separation of church and state becomes a constitutional violation. And I mean, I don't think people realize how far we have strayed from the Constitution and what is understood by both religious freedom and the separation of church and state. And that's why I wrote my second book, American Crusade.
So what do you say to like people that, say, well, the church, the separation of church and state isn't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. It was like, Danbury Baptist, Jefferson, Roger Williams, whatever, that you can't necessarily use that argument against me.
Yeah, it's a very popular argument. Lauren Boebert made it recently. So did Trump's former press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany. Pete Hegseth. It's like really popular on Fox News. Sure. But right, the argument, as you said, right, it's the actual words separation of church and state aren't in the Constitution. And look, I gotta say, I think it's one of the most feeble arguments out there. I'm so surprised that it's still used. And as you pointed out, yes, that phrase comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists on New Year's Day in 1802. And he celebrated the whole First Amendment as building that wall of separation between church and state. But the Supreme Court itself, first of all, has endorsed the view many, many times. The first time in 1878, which is not something you're going to hear about from the other side. And then they did it again in 1947 and in 1948 and in 1961, 3 different times, and in 62 and in 63 and in 68 and in 73 and on and on and on and on. And then again and again and again and again in countless concurrences and dissents and lower courts opinions. Okay. And James Madison, used similar language. James Madison, who we call the father of the Constitution and the father of the Bill of Rights. He said that strongly guarded is the separation between religion and government in the Constitution of the United States. Right. I mean, that's pretty darn clear. And the idea that, well, the words themselves aren't in the Constitution verbatim. Well, I mean, neither is the phrase fair trial. But it's a phrase that we use to describe several big rights that are protected in the Bill of Rights, right? The idea that it doesn't appear verbatim to me is just, it's kind of not weak sauce, I think is how I might phrase it.
I think that's what the kids call it.
That's what the kids call it. I mean, especially again, when you pair it with everything that I mentioned earlier about, drawing power from the people, not mentioning a God, about the ban on religious tests, you put all that together and it really is, it's clear what they were trying to do.
Yeah. So let's talk kind of more current. Like what are some, significant cases in the news that you're following and or maybe arguing that involve separation of church and state?
Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. Representative Matt Gaetz just the other day or today or announced, I guess we can say, that he's going to propose a prayer bill to get prayer back into public schools, which again, like this is like one of those myths where it's like, kids can pray in public schools. Like,
I know
nothing is stopping kids from praying in public schools. This is an unnecessary idea. I mean, there's a really old joke that as long as there are math tests in schools, there's going to be prayer. And like nothing has ever stopped kids from praying in public schools. They have that right. They are free to have that right. And in fact, the organization I work for, Americans Unite for Separation of Church and State, would be first on board to, if that right was truly threatened, to be standing against it. The fact of the matter is it's not. It's that right is not under threat at all. What we are seeing with for instance Gaetz' bill is him encouraging students and teachers and administrators to pressure kids into prayer, or to allow that kind of pressure to happen. What we want when we're talking about the separation of church and state is, okay, you can't use the machinery of the state to impose your religion on other people's kids. And that's what kind of Gates is really trying to encourage with his bill. So that's just one recent example that I was dealing with as I was rushing to get into this podcast with you this morning with my team. And that bill, I mean, like most of what he does, that's more for attention rather than actual policy. It's not gonna go anywhere. Certainly not going to get through the Senate. So, but I mean, what we have really seen again over the last 10 years is just this crazy shift in the way that courts handle these cases. And in American Crusade, I date this to this push to warp the legal definition of religious freedom and to end church-state separation. You can go back further, but there's this 2010 case involving a Christian cross in the Mojave Desert. And the Supreme Court issues this opinion in this case. And the Supreme Court is essentially signaling the start of this crusade about what Sotomayor was writing about in that dissent that I read earlier. And you get this whole host of Christian nationalist legal groups that make up this billion-dollar shadow network. Groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and the American Center for Law and Justice and the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty and Liberty Council and First Liberty Institute, this Orwellian word salad. And they heard that message in 2010 opinion in the Mojave Desert Cross case, and the floodgates opened. And they file lawsuit after lawsuit, and they stoke this fear of status loss, and they raise billions of dollars. And what you see is these crusading groups set these cases up, and then the conservative justices on the court come and knock them down. And that accelerates once Trump took office and then packed the Supreme Court. And it really does begin to look a lot like collusion, especially when we find out that some of these same groups and these same donors to those groups are wining and dining the justices on private super yachts and private jets and on island hopping vacations, none of which were disclosed. And one of the things that I try to do in American Crusade is to tell the stories kind of behind these, but the numbers here are they're jaw-dropping, because when they set out to capture the courts, we saw some studies crunch the numbers, and the studies don't go over the last two terms. So the numbers that I'm about to recite to you are actually like more dramatic than what I'm going to tell you. So before the courts were packed, the court ruled in favor of religion about half the time. And that's what you'd expect. Like if you were guessing, you flip a coin. I don't know, you win half the time. But under John Roberts, one study found that win rate for religion jumps to 81%.
Jeez.
And importantly, Will, I mean, this to me was like one of the shocking points. It's not a pro-religion shift. It's a pro-Christian shift. In early courts, Christianity was favored in about 44% of the cases. Again, kind of what you would expect, coin flip. Under Roberts, that goes up to 85%. That's nearly doubled. And again, favoring mainstream Christianity. So what we are seeing is that religious freedom has become a weapon of Christian privilege. And in American Crusade, I work to put a face on those numbers. And I think you can really see that the guiding principle of this new Supreme Court is not the Constitution or the law, but simply this: Christianity wins. And so, I'm answering your question about what are the things that I'm watching right now by reciting these statistics and pointing to this crusade, because so much is happening and things are changing so rapidly. And these crusading groups they feel and believe, and you can tell this in the way that they litigate, in the way that they treat procedure, in the way that they treat facts and reality. They feel entitled to take any case they want to this Supreme Court and litigate it, and expect to win before the Supreme Court when they do. And I'm happy to talk about more of the specifics. I think one of the best examples of that is the Coach Kennedy case that people remember. This was, and I won't get into it because I'm filibustering on your show, and I apologize.
We'll definitely get into the Kennedy case a little bit, because we when we had when we had Amanda Tyler on, we sort of talked about that ad nauseum. But it was sort of important to me because I came from Burtram, like that's.
Oh, you did! Wow,
yeah, that's my
wow, fascinating.
Yeah. And I lived just right down the street from the high school.
Fascinating.
So, but you already kind of touched on this a little bit about the Supreme Court decisions impacting kind of our legal landscape for church-state separation type cases. But can you discuss certain cases like ones that maybe weren't necessarily in the news as much, like the Espinoza v. Montana or the Fulton v. Philadelphia.
Yeah, the Fulton's a little dicier to discuss because the way the court decided it was sort of this really strange legal esoteric kind of question that they ended up settling on. But the Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue case is a really fascinating case. And most people, you're right, don't know about it. And so the Montana Constitution protects the religious freedom of every taxpayer by declaring that the state cannot make any direct or indirect payment from any public fund or money to, and then they have a whole list of things that say basically for any sectarian purpose or church or religious school, and then, kind of every different synonym for school that's controlled in whole or part by a church or a sect or a denomination. Okay. So that's called a no aid clause. And it's this really important principle that, again, it protects the religious freedom of every taxpayer. Because if the government can use its coercive taxing power to take money out of your pocket and then turn around and give it to a religion that's not your own, which may even say, you're going to hell for all eternity or something like that, it's violating your religious freedom. Right. I mean, another way to think of that is it's in government enforced tithing. And this is one of the things that the founders were really, really against. Thomas Jefferson said that it was, quote, sinful and tyrannical for the government to use its taxing power to support religion. It was one of the things that really motivated a lot of the founders to separate church and state. And yet in Montana, the state legislature in, I think it was 2015, adopted a scheme that would funnel public money to Christian schools. And now vouchers are sort of this ever-evolving hydra. It's crazy to try to fight them. But the core point of any kind of voucher is that it relies on the government's taxing power to fund private education. And that private education is overwhelmingly religious and Christian, often well over 90%, sometimes 100% Christian schools are getting this. And so using the taxing power is the hallmark of vouchers, and it's the problem with vouchers, okay? And that's precisely what Montana did. And this neo-voucher scheme that they created, it was like a bizarre shell game. Okay? Again, it depended entirely on the state's taxing power. So here's how, this is a little oversimplified. Taxpayers owe Montana money. And instead of paying the state, Montana said, taxpayers, you can divert that money off and put it in a private scholarship fund that will pay for private, again, mostly religious education. And then the state in return forgives that debt. Okay, so it's $1 sent to the private school scholarship fund is $1 off your taxes. And the scholarships could only be used for private schools. Only one scholarship fund was created of all the schools to receive eligible scholarships. All but one, so all of them except for one was Christian. And in the year before the litigation, all but 3 of the scholarships, so 94% of the scholarships went to Christian schools. And really, the scholarship fund is it's this financial waypoint. It's an empty husk of an organization. It was actually run by a single volunteer because it required no effort at all. It's money laundering.
Sure.
We're talking about money laundering by another name. Okay, so the Montana Department of Revenue is tasked with sort of managing this program, and it has to create these rules, and it's looking at it. And the law that created the program says that it has to be administered in compliance with the Constitution. So the Montana Department of Revenue is like, well, what are we supposed to do here? Because you have this whole program that says it has to be administered with the Constitution. The Constitution says the whole program's unconstitutional. So the Montana Department of Revenue crafts this rule that says, okay, we're going to try to do this, but that means that the public money, these scholarships, can't go to a school that's run by a church. And so you get one of those crusader groups that I mentioned earlier, the Institute for Justice, sues over this rule. And this is a group that is just fueled by Coke money. The Institute for Justice lost repeatedly. In fact, the Montana Supreme Court looked at this program, this neo-voucher scheme, and it said, we're throwing the whole thing out. Like, not just the part with religion, the entire program has got to go. And that's because one of the things that the state constitution does is also protect and fund public education, in addition to that religious freedom stuff. And during the Constitutional Convention, the delegates explained that if you divert any money from public funds or a public school system, it weakens that system. And especially when you do it in favor of schools that are established for private or religious purposes. Okay, so you can't do that. But 6 months after Brett Kavanaugh's concern, the Institute for Justice asked the Supreme Court to take the case, and the justices just leap at this chance to attack the separation of church and state. So Justice Roberts writes this 5-4 majority opinion with Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh all joining him, and they effectively gutted that compelled support principle, that sinful and tyrannical principle in the Montana Constitution, right? That principle that protects us from government enforced tithing. And Roberts essentially, it's a really remarkable and disturbing opinion in many ways. He ignores these huge swaths of American law and American history, and again ignores our Constitution's truly original contributions to the world, and he disposes of all of it in one sentence. And he says, we do not see how that compelled support principle in the Montana Constitution promotes religious freedom. We don't see how it promotes religious freedom. That's it. 200 years of legal principles just swatted aside in one willfully blind sentence. And what he really does is Roberts says effectively that state church separation is discrimination. So he bastardizes a principle that protects equality into a tool for Christian privilege. And he pulls off that magic trick by focusing, in his opinion, only on Christians and ignoring everybody else. So, again, it gets to those studies, those data points that I was reciting to you earlier, right? This is one of the cases in those data points where you get the doubling of Christian wins before the Supreme Court. This is one of those examples.
How kind of relatedly, like, so how does the government, or how does the public maybe accept the fact that, when Congress approves the whatever 800 billion, bit of money for like the NDAA, that some of that money goes towards chaplains and the building of churches and stuff like that. I've always wondered, like taxpayers are already paying for, salaries of clergy, and building of churches. So how does that work?
It's even crazier when you think about it, because the chaplains in Congress make obscene salaries, and they actually have staff. I mean, we spend a huge chunk of money on the chaplains for members of Congress, and if you look at how many houses of worship there are in DC, it becomes even more ridiculous. Right, like it's such an unnecessary and wasteful spending. But anyway, that's a side point. James Madison thought that military chaplains were unconstitutional. He wrote about that. He thought that they were a palpable violation of equal protection. And I think there's a really good argument to be made that they are. What you've identified is one of those problems that we talked about earlier, where the founders were not always true to their principles. Now, what we have said in the modern era about chaplains is, when the government puts a burden on your religious freedom, the government can sometimes step in and alleviate that burden. And so the military is a good example for us to think about this. And so I'm glad you chose that, because, like, imagine you are a soldier serving overseas and you are a Christian and you're in the Middle East, and maybe it's very difficult for you to find a church where you can safely worship.
Yeah, and right? just so you know, like I was a Christian.
That was you. Okay,
I deployed to Iraq, and we did have a chaplain.
Okay, so there you go. The good example then. Like, and in that instance, right, we have said, okay, well, this is a pretty big burden on somebody's religious freedom. We're going to say that the government can alleviate that burden. And one of the things that they can do then is have a chaplain to alleviate that burden. The problem that we're seeing now is that people are like, oh, well, chaplains are okay without thinking through that government-imposed burden analysis. And so you see chaplains starting to crop up all over the place. And one of the things you asked me about earlier was, what are some of the things I'm watching? One of the things I'm watching is Texas passed a law this past legislative session that allows school districts to replace guidance counselors with chaplains, which is just a disaster waiting to happen, right? And there's no government-imposed burden on the free exercise of students' religion, right? They're not in school 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're not boarding there. They're not far from their home churches, right? They're going to a local school just like they would go to a local church. They can freely worship as much or as little as they want. That's not what this law is designed to do. The Texas law is designed to use the machinery of the state to impose that religion on a captive audience of school children, right? That's what it is designed to do. And it's pretty clear that's what it's designed to do. And this is something that the organization I work for, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, is going to be watching really, really closely. We're already in contact with a lot of folks in Texas over this law. That to me is clearly unconstitutional, where you have a harder argument against the chaplains who might be serving members of our military. But even in that case, and I wonder if you've experienced this at all in your service, is that we often see that chaplains overstep their bounds in military service, or the military itself maybe not doing the best job of actually alleviating everybody's burdens on their religious freedom. So, not doing a good job. Christian chaplains are way overrepresented compared to Christians in the military itself. There are minority religious chaplains as well, but the military has also refused to allow humanist chaplains to come in and serve the humanist members of the military, which are probably upwards of a quarter of the folks in the military now. So, I mean, there's still a whole lot of problems that surround that, in addition to the funding issues.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So when we had Amanda on the show, mm-hmm. one of her concerns was the fate of the Lemon test, especially after the Kennedy v. Burtram. So can you, number one, just describe what the Lemon test is?
Oh, I would love to.
And then
I'd love to.
And then, what its implications are if it's dissolved or whatever.
Yes. So the Lemon test comes from a 1971 Supreme Court case, Lemon versus Kurtzman, which was also about money flowing to private religious schools that were segregated, which is not something you often hear about when you hear about the Lemon test. And actually, Alton Lemon, the guy who gives this case its name, he was this really interesting guy. He served in the Army. He graduated from Morehouse College with a mathematics degree. There's a little story I love about him playing basketball with Martin Luther King Jr. He was a government employee, and he was a black humanist. And Pennsylvania, where he was living, passed a law that propped up religious schools with taxpayer money. It was this, again, I mentioned vouchers being this sort of hydra. This is sort of like a vouchers for teachers scheme. So the state would pay for teachers to teach at religious schools if they weren't teaching religion classes. Basically, vouchers for teacher salaries instead of for student tuition. And the state had paid out, I think, about $5 million by the time that Alton Lemon challenged the program. And it was combined with another case. The Pennsylvania case was combined with another case from Rhode Island. It was basically the same case. And all 250 or so of the teachers under that program that were paid were at Catholic schools. And so Alton Lemon argues that in the Pennsylvania case, the non-public schools are segregated by race and religion. And that the new program that has created, this voucher program, perpetuates and promotes the segregation of the races. Right? And the end result was the state promoting, and I have the quote here, it was promoting two systems in Pennsylvania, a public school system predominantly black, poor, and inferior, and a private subsidized school system predominantly white, affluent, and superior. Now, that's not something you often hear about in the discussion of the Lemon case that this was really also about race. And it goes back to what I was trying to talk about earlier, where I really do believe that separation of church and state connects to every other issue out there in ways that people just fundamentally miss. Now, the lower courts sort of winnowed out the race issues, and the Supreme Court actively was like, okay, we won't touch that. And instead, what the court does in that case was it strikes down that program as a violation of the separation of church and state correctly. And to me, the fascinating thing about the case is that the court, if you pay attention to the people who don't like the Lemon test, the Crusaders and people who are opposed to separation of church and state, they act like the Supreme Court just created this test out of whole cloth. That's a phrase you'll often hear. People love this whole cloth. And that's not true. What the court did was survey all of the cases that it had decided over like 2 centuries that involved religion and the law colliding. And then it synthesized from all of those cases this simple 3-part test to determine when a government action crosses that line, when a government action violates separation of church and state. And basically what it asks is it's a three-pronged test. And it says, does the challenged government action, 1, does it have a secular purpose? 2, does it have a primary effect that neither advances nor inhibits religion? And 3, does it foster excessive government entanglement with religion? I always have a hard time getting that one out. Excessive government entanglement with religion. And if the government action fails any one of those 3, then it violates the Constitution. Okay? And again, the thing that I think is crucial, which has been now a theme of our conversation, Will, is that the concurring justices, when they struck down this program, they did it to enhance religious freedom. Because when you defend the separation of church and state, you are defending true religious freedom. And what they said was that when taxpayers of many faiths are required to contribute money for the propagation of one faith, the free exercise clause is infringed. So this is a test that was strong precedent. Right? It was an 8-1 decision. It was older than Roe versus Wade, and it was built on all of these earlier cases. But because the Lemon test enforces the separation of church and state, it becomes this serious barrier to the crusade that I detail in American Crusade in the book. So finally, to answer your question, I think what the court did in the Kennedy decision with Lemon was actually worse in some ways than what it did with Roe versus Wade and Dobbs, right? So people will remember in the Dobbs decision, the court says Roe versus Wade is overturned, and it's flat and it's clear and it's awful and it's a terrible impact. But in the Kennedy decision, it says something a little different. And again, Roe was not as this strong old precedent synthesizing an entire body of law that was overturned the way it was here. And what the court uses in this case is the word abandoned. The majority says that Lemon was abandoned and essentially says, look, judges, you should have known that we abandoned this test long ago. They recognized that it was dead. They didn't explicitly overturn it. They just said, you should have known it was overturned a long time ago because it has been pretty heavily criticized. And I actually think in a way that that's more dangerous. And the reason I think it's more dangerous is because if you're a lower court judge and you read that, you're thinking, oh, well, I know of other things that I don't like that have been criticized and therefore must have been abandoned a long time ago, right? Like it's a green light for these Trump judges and these judges in the Fifth Circuit and these judges who are handling the mifepristone case, right? That are come right out of some of those groups like First Liberty Institute that I mentioned earlier. It's a green light for them to go crazy and ignore precedent and claim that it has been abandoned if they don't like it. All they have to do is find a little bit of criticism of it somewhere and they can make that argument credibly in their opinions. So I actually think it was a really alarming opinion. And the fact that it came in the Kennedy versus Bremerton decision is just, a double whammy.
Yeah. I mean, so how do they, or how will they judge religious liberty type cases going
forward? Such a good question. It's such a good question because how do you do it when the Lemon test didn't just get created out of a whole cloth, right? It did synthesize all of these principles. And it's really fascinating to watch judges and courts struggle with this, because all of the principles still exist, even if you don't give them the name, the Lemon test. So you have all these judges who are handling these cases since that opinion came down. They're like, okay, well, I guess we don't do Lemon, but there's still coercion. There's still like the problem that it doesn't have a secular purpose, and it definitely advances religion. But and it's like, well, what do we do? Because the principles are all still there. And one of the things that the Supreme Court is trying to push for, and that these crusader groups are trying to push for, is forget all of that and just focus on history and tradition.
Yeah,
that's what they want, and that's a terrible argument for a whole number of reasons. But not the least of which is the fact that they don't get history and tradition right. This goes to what we were talking about earlier. This is why I wrote the first book, The Founding Myth, because a lot of what they rely on is flat out wrong. George Washington didn't pray in the snow at Valley Forge, right? The Founding Fathers did not pray at the Constitutional Convention and rejected the suggestion that they should. It's all of those things that they rely on that are fundamentally flawed. And so you really see that in the Dobbs opinion also, the Sam Alito's opinion overturning Roe versus Wade. He talks about the history and tradition all the time and just gets it so breathtakingly wrong. Just like so much of the history in that opinion is just bad history, right? These are not historians. They are lawyers and politicians trying to make an argument and then sort of defend it after the fact by pointing to history.
Well, so we spoke with this one Bible scholar who does Bible interpretations and all kinds of other stuff. And he wrote a book called The Bible and the Ballot. And we had him on the show, talked to him about all kinds of stuff. And, one of the questions we had asked him was about religious persecution. I mean, like, I'm a Christian. I don't necessarily think like my religious liberties are being affected. I go to church, I do all the Christian things, but like, I don't feel like I'm under attack. And what the scholar said is something that has always stuck with me. He basically said Christians worrying about being persecuted, basically have forgotten that throughout history, like Christians were persecuted, and that was just sort of like the thing you sign up for. You're like, you got to carry your cross with you. Like so. Yeah. So he had a hard time understanding why there's all this emphasis on us being persecuted, which we're not. But in his mind, is even if you were, you just like turn the other cheek and like obey the laws of the land. But I want to ask you just two more questions. The first one, sometimes when we think about church-state separation or religious liberty, it's always, at least for me, it always seems like it's in the context of believers and non-believers. Non-believers don't want the Bible shoved down their throat. But rarely do I hear conversations about minority religions and how some of this stuff actually affects them. So like, what's your thought or opinion, or do you have any experience with, other sort of minority religions that aren't necessarily being talked about?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's really, truly beautiful about the separation of church and state is that it does protect everybody, and it protects all religions. It doesn't matter whether they have a majority or a minority. It really protects absolutely everybody. And that's what it was designed to do. There's this quote of Thomas Jefferson's where he talks about how it protects, everybody from, and he gets, it's antiquated. He talks about it protecting Hindus, which he spells with two O's, Mohammedans, and the infidel of every stripe, right? And I think the fundamental right to be treated equally under the law depends upon the separation of church and state, right? Because this is a principle that ensures that we can all live as ourselves and believe as we choose, so long as we're not hurting others. And what we're seeing right now is that religious extremists and Christian nationalists and their lawmaker allies are trying to force everyone else to live by their beliefs and to use religion as a license to harm others. They're threatening our freedom to live as ourselves. And that widens inequality in our communities and our countries. Again, so our nation promises the freedom to believe as they want, but our laws cannot allow anyone else to use their religious beliefs to harm others. And so this is one of the reasons that I just absolutely love working at Americans Unite for a Separation of Church and State, because we bring together people of all religions and none. I mean, and a lot of our cases involve Christians and atheists and humanists and Hindus and Jews and people from all over the religious spectrum and the non-religious spectrum to fight in the courts and the legislatures and the public square for freedom without favor and equality without exception. And one of the ways that you prevent that persecution from happening is having that robust separation of church and state and shielding our laws from any religion's influence frees us to come together as equals and build a stronger democracy.
Now, last question, and this is sort of a, I don't know, like a worst case scenario, but like, how do you see, this church state evolving, in the next, I don't know, 100 years or so? Like, if we keep on the same trajectory that we're going on, and then maybe a sort of sub bullet point is, and I wish Josh was here because I think he'd really benefit. I mean, he'll listen to this episode anyways, but but like what role do religious leaders play, and helping with the work that you do?
Well, another thing that I think is really unique about Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and that is one of the reasons I wanted to work for them, is that in a lot of the lawsuits that we bring to defend the separation of church and state, religious leaders and clergy are front and center as plaintiffs. So, for instance, in the abortion lawsuit that we brought in Missouri, which challenges the state abortion ban as a violation of the separation of church and state, all of our plaintiffs are clergy. We have 13 different clergy from 8 different denominations in that lawsuit who are challenging the abortion ban, which turns two narratives from the other side completely on its head, that the idea that, abortion is this sacred issue that only goes one way, and that separation of church and state is anti-religious. And the same thing in the lawsuit that we just filed in Oklahoma over the first religious public school in the nation. And yet you heard that right. It's religious public school. We're talking about a Catholic public school, which our brains just can't comprehend. It's a charter school, but that's a public school. We have 3 different members of the clergy who are on board in that lawsuit, along with a whole host of other people, including parents and families, et cetera. And they are clergy out there defending the separation of church and state. The Kennedy versus Bremerton case, the one that we've talked about a couple times, right? Americans United litigated that case at the Supreme Court. And every local clergy that got involved in that case got involved on our side to defend the separation of church and state, and came out against the coach that wanted to use his power over other people's children to force his prayer on them. So, I think that it's incumbent upon religious leaders in this country to explain why the separation of church and state is what allows them to do their job, right? Without that separation, the government's going to be in there telling them what's okay and what's not. Right. I mean, that is what protects their religious freedom as well as ours. It's absolutely crucial for that. This is something that every American benefits from, and every American really ought to be defending. So I think there's absolutely a role in terms of the future. My predictions 100 years down the road, I genuinely don't know. I do worry that we are in a spot where we are quickly losing this principle. If it's not already gone, and that people need to stand up and fight back. And that's one of the reasons I do the work that I do every day at Americans United. And if you want to join up, it's au.org. We'd love to get some more support.
Well, that's awesome. And well, I really appreciate your insight, Andrew. This has been a much too short conversation, at least for me, anyways. But like
I'll come back on if you want. I love talking about this stuff. If you can't tell,
that's good. Like how can people get a hold of you, or even get a hold of your books?
So my books are available at fine bookstores everywhere. American Crusade: How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom, and The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. If you need a endorsement of that one, Pastor Greg Locke, who's sort of this really right-wing preacher with ties to the Proud Boys, took a blowtorch and filmed himself burning the founding myth. So there's that. I work with Americans United, AU.org. We'd love to have your support there. And then if you want to find me personally, I'm Andrew L. Seidel, Seidel, on all of the social things.
So Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it.
Twitter/X, yeah, Instagram, TikTok. I'm on them all. Yeah, I mean, if you got a follow-up question from this, definitely find me and ask me. I'm happy to answer there.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Andrew, for everything. We really appreciate your expertise. And and we will see our listeners and viewers next week. Take care.
Thank you so much.